Well, thank you all for coming today. I had forgotten until I walked in that they recently put this sign up here. It's not that it's not a memorial. It's my mother knew about this auditorium, and she named me for the auditorium actually. So, usually I like for people to have a PowerPoint, Karen, because the screen hides that. Anyway, we're delighted to have all of you here today for the annual Charles and Rosemary Licata lecture. And as you will see from your program that you received as you came in, this lecture series has a very impressive history with a number of outstanding speakers through the years, and we're delighted to maintain the quality of our speakers, Rosemary, with our very distinguished speaker today. Our speaker is going to speak for a while, and then at the end we're going to have about 20 minutes for question and answering. At that point I'll probably remind you of this, but I'd like to give our students maybe the priority for question period. And we're delighted to have a number of students here. We have a number of visitors here, friends of the university. And I won't try to introduce any because we would be here all day. We're also delighted that C-SPAN is here to make a record of this event. And I would like to acknowledge that we have a number of visitors here who are students from not only the School of Public Policy, but also from Seaver College, our undergraduate college. Professor Dan Caldwell is here with his class from Seaver College. And then I wonder if I could have everyone who is here from Seaver College students, would you just stand for a second and let us recognize you? Very glad to have you. Mainly I wanted our recruitment people to see who you are. And then we have a number of students here. We've got a lot of students here from the School of Public Policy, and this is their home territory, so I want to ask them to stand. But we also have some students here who are they just pay tuition. We also have some people here who are thinking about coming to the School of Public Policy, and they're visiting us today. And I think maybe a couple of dozen who are visitors here. So I wonder if you would stand, if you're our guest here just checking us out, if you would stand, let us welcome you. So now, if you were students here today, you would get out of class for an hour early in order to get to come to a lecture. So keep that in mind. We're delighted to have Karen House as our Licata lecturer today. Ms. House served as a publisher of the Wall Street Journal from 2002 to 2006, but also held various roles throughout a 32-year career with the Dow Jones and Company, most recently as Senior Vice President and member of the company's executive committee. Part of her career with Dow Jones led her to around the world as foreign correspondent and diplomatic correspondent, energy correspondent, and in those various roles she received a number of journalism awards, including a Pulitzer Prize for her international reporting on her coverage of the Middle East. In both her news and her business roles, Ms. House has interviewed a number of world leaders, including Saddam Hussein, Lee Kuan Yew, Vladimir Putin, Margaret Thatcher, Richard Nixon, George H.W. Bush, Yasser Arafat, probably even a dean or two along the way. She's appeared frequently over the past 3 decades on Washington Week in Review. Many of you will have seen her on Meet the Press or Face the Nation, more recently as an expert on international relations to comment on PBS or Casey sorry to say KCET, that's our PBS, or Fox News or CNN or several of the other channels. Her most recent book that you will recognize in your program, and she will be available afterwards to sign copies of her book outside, on Saudi Arabia, provides an inside look based on her 30 years of reporting at the shrouded Saudi society. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to Karen House.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wildren and Mrs. Licata. It's a real pleasure to be here. I appreciate, I'm honored by being invited to deliver this lecture. Dr. Wilburn graciously said my latest book, I gotta confess it's my only book. But I spent 30 years, as he said, going to Saudi Arabia, mostly as a reporter or foreign editor, talking to Saudi officials about oil, Iraq-Iran, Arab-Israeli, U.S.-Saudi, so geopolitical issues. And when I retired from the journal in 2006, the one thing I was really interested in doing with my newfound time was trying to understand Saudi society. How did Saudis look at each other? What was the society like? How did they look at their rulers? How did they look at us? And as I speak about Saudi Arabia, everyone constantly asks me, why did you do that? Why did you spend 5 years, month after month, going there? Dressed in my long black abaya. My editor asked me that actually when I turned in the manuscript. She said, you know, why did you do this? And I said, because it's interesting. And she said, Paris is interesting. So why did you do this? You know, make me understand. That was her only editing point on the book. So I will try to make you understand why I found it both fascinating and important. Saudi Arabia is probably the strangest country you will never see. It is so different from our own. A woman there never reaches the age of maturity. She is always under the control of some man. She cannot go to her son's school. She cannot even see her son graduate. She obviously doesn't drive, we all know that. She doesn't appear in public without being covered. And you know, in the worst situations, she is simply chattel for a man to do as he wishes with. That's not the norm, I hasten to add, but it does happen. It's a very religiously dominated society in which men obey Allah and women obey men. And Allah is distant and men are at hand. It is probably less strange to me than it is to most visitors because of my own background. Like Matthew here, who's from a little town in Alabama. I'm from a little town in Texas, 900 people with 4 churches, 1 blinking stoplight, and no movie theaters. So religion was what people did. Everyone went to church, and my father was far more conservative than the average person in the town. We were not permitted to wear pants, shorts, no alcohol, no dancing, no musical instruments in our Church of Christ. In lots of ways, I was quite at home in Saudi Arabia. I devoted my time to trying to figure this country out precisely because I think it is the one Arab country that is truly strategic. Not only because it is the world's largest exporter of oil, which sustains the Western way of life, but because Saudi Arabia, I am convinced, will be critical in the ultimate resolution of what is the proper Islam, which is going on now between the radical jihadists, if you will, and the more modernizing Muslims. And that very battle also goes on inside Saudi Arabia. To try to understand the society, I knew that it's like someone coming here to write a book about America. You wouldn't be able to go to Washington and New York and claim to understand America. So I had to be confident that I could get outside of Riyadh, there Washington, and Jeddah, there New York. And I was permitted to, over those 5 years, I went all over the country, and I saw all kinds of people, a lot of the royal family, but also very poor people, men, women, young people, old people. And it was an advantage, frankly, to be a woman because you could talk to both men and women. A Western woman in Saudi Arabia is basically an honorary man. So most men are prepared to talk to you, even some of the senior religious officials who, of course, believe it is wrong to be in the presence of a woman who's not your relative. In the beginning, I had a 1 month, one entry visa. Then I got a 3-month visa, and then I was given a 5-year multiple entry visa. And at that point, I came and went as I chose. I did not have to deal with a government minder. I would use a cell phone and a hired car from the hotel and call friends and get them to pass me to other people. So my goal was not to prescribe what Saudi Arabia ought to be like, but to try to understand and describe what it was like. So I want to talk today first about some observations about Saudi society, and then second about what those observations might portend about its stability or vulnerability, and then lastly about scenarios that U.S. policymakers, which may someday include some of you in the audience, might face. Saudi society, this probably should not have surprised me, but it did. It is much more diverse than we in the West think. There are people who live quite Western lives inside their homes, and there are obviously people who seek to live a 7th century life. It is also much more divided than I realized, and much more dependent on government, because most people work for the government. The divisions are quite deep, so it's not, in my view, really a country as much as it is a collection of tribes with a flag. And it is divided by region, by religious sect. The majority are Sunni, but there are Shias, Sufis, Ismailis. Divided by gender. And people have a deep distrust of each other, so they don't really mix much outside of their family. So I'm going to show you my version of how I think the society functions. This is a Saudi, this little figure here, who is inside a family. who is inside a tribe, which is inside a country ruled by the religious establishment, and all of that is ruled by the royal family. And so it's a quite constricted, if you will, society. The religious establishment legitimizes the rule of the Al Saud by giving them the Good Housekeeping seal of approval for their religiosity. Otherwise, the Al Saud would be just another tribe. But 250 years ago, one of the Al Sauds met up with a Mr. Ibn Abdul Wahhab, as in Wahhabism, and Mr. Wahhab wanted to conquer Arabia for the one true God, feeling that the area had strayed from the teaching of the Prophet, and Muhammad Saud wanted to conquer it for himself. So together they did conquer Arabia because it was more productive to fight in the name of God than in the name of the Al Saud, and so that symbiotic relationship has existed ever since. People live literally behind walls, so most people's homes are surrounded by walls 10 or 12 feet high, and they live inside even higher walls, figuratively. They are bound, if you will, by, like a mummy, in the bindings of tradition and religion, so that there's a rigidity that keeps people from having much independence or individualism. But the internet and social media and satellite TV are penetrating those walls now in a big way, so that young people, and 60% of the population of Saudi Arabia is under 20 years of age. So those young people have grown up without knowing an impoverished Saudi Arabia, only knowing a, if you will, declining one. The development was done in the 70s and 80s, and as the population has exploded, many of the services have actually deteriorated. So young people do not have a lot of gratitude to the royal family for what they did for them. They say, why haven't you done more? They are hearing through these media other versions of Islam besides the Wahhabi version. So they are also learning to question as well as communicate, which is a very new thing in Saudi Arabia. The country exists basically on 3 pillars of stability, and in my view, all of those are cracking. Religion is obviously one of them, and in a secular society like our own, it's almost impossible to imagine the omnipresence of religion in Saudi Arabia. Every university like this, every shopping mall, every airport has rows of prayer rugs with the direction of Mecca properly pointed, so that people pray in the break at the proper times during the day. They leave class, the shopping malls close. Everyone goes to pray. And I went one day, one weekend, which there would be Thursday and Friday, with a Saudi family. The parents had been educated in the U.S., and they took me on a picnic out in the desert. And at the end of the evening, the family was praying the final prayer of the day, and I was sitting on a rug. And at the end of that, their 6-year-old son came to me and he said, I need to teach you something. And I said, sure. And he said, do you know what to say when the angel of death comes? and he could tell I did not. So he proceeded, and he says, "Who is your God?" And you say, "Allah." And then he says, "Who is your prophet?" And you say, "Muhammad." "What is your faith?" And you say, "Islam." "What are your works?" And you say, "I heard and I believed." And Muslims apparently believe that this grave interview occurs immediately after you're buried. And if you have been a good Muslim and properly answer these questions, you're borne aloft and shown a window on heaven and then put back in your grave to await Judgment Day. And if you have not been a good Muslim and cannot properly answer these questions, you are pulverized and put back together, and pulverized and put back together for eternity until the Judgment Day. So this little boy, who had learned this in school, not from his parents actually, wanted to save me that dreadful fate. I also lived to try to understand the very conservative religious mentality with a woman very conservative woman. She would have made my father look liberal. And she had translated for me at several dinners with an imam's mother and sisters and wife. So I asked her if I could live with her for a week, and she said yes. So behind the walls, she opened the gate, and as we walked in, she said, "That's where she lives," meaning the first wife. And we went upstairs where this lady, named Lulwa, or Lulu for short, lived. And when her husband came up, as he did every 24 hours, I had to go and hide in my room because obviously he was not supposed to encounter he knew I was there, but to encounter a woman who was not a relative. She had a TV, but they got only the religious channel, which does not allow any women on, because the Saudi state TV now does have women with their heads covered, but their faces uncovered. And she regarded that as totally improper. And I'm convinced that she allowed me to do this because she wanted to convert me. And she spent a lot of time. Actually, the first thing she made me do, she took out the family computer and dialed up a YouTube video, 6 episodes, 6 10-minute episodes by a fundamentalist preacher in Texas. She had done her homework. A fundamentalist preacher in Texas who had converted to Islam. And when that didn't lead to a conversion, she called her brother over, and we had more discussions. I read the Quran 3 times during this 5-year period because it was great fun to discuss religion with people. But all of this new information that young people and old people, if they choose, have access to is eroding the credibility of the religious establishment, which increasingly is seen by really religious people like her as doing the will of King Abdullah rather than the will of Allah. And they point to things like mixing is wrong, and yet the king has built a big new university outside of Jeddah called the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, which not only mixes Saudi men and women, but mixes them with infidel men and women from all over the world. And when one of the 20 senior religious scholars was asked about the appropriateness of this on TV, he said it's wrong, and the king fired him because the king appoints these 20 people, and not surprisingly, many of the other senior ulama begin to discover that the prophet had had his hair washed by women and other things that made this okay. So people see this, if you will, double standard, and it has undermined the credibility of the religious establishment, obviously with the deeply religious, but also with those who don't mind the mixing at all, but just think it's, if the king can get the religious to approve this, why can't he make them approve more things like women driving or whatever? The second pillar of stability in the kingdom is obviously the oil wealth that buys at least acquiescence, if not loyalty, anymore for the government and royal family. 90% of the treasury in Saudi Arabia comes from oil wealth. It's a country that does not tax people because there's a saying there, you know, that here we have no taxation without representation, and there it's no representation without taxation, and the royal family doesn't tax, therefore you don't get the representation. But oil wealth obviously funds the jobs of Saudis, and most all Saudis work for the government. 90% of the workers in the private sector are foreigners. So there are 19 roughly million Saudis and 8 to 9 million foreigners in the kingdom. Because energy is subsidized and cheap, people waste it, and it has now become again a subject in the Saudi press and discussed among Saudis that what's going to happen if we continue to use more and we have less to export, and it's exports of oil that fund our lifestyle. Now, it is possible that the government will find a way to tell people we're going to cut the subsidies, but in this post-Arab Spring environment, they're not inclined to take things from people. And the country has $500 billion in foreign reserves, so it's hardly broke. But there are Saudi financial institutions who estimate that the government spending will exceed government revenues by 2014 because after the Arab Spring, when King Abdullah came home from back surgery, he passed out $130 billion to the society on top of a $180 billion annual budget. So more money for student stipends, more money to the religious establishment, more money to everyone, and created a minimum wage for the first time for Saudis, obviously not for foreigners. And lastly is the royal family itself, the third pillar of stability, which I think is weakening. The biggest internal issue in the kingdom, I think, is the aged and infirm leadership. This latest Saudi state was declared in 1932 by Abdulaziz ibn Saud. And when he died in 1953, the crown has passed from one of his, first to his eldest son, and then from brother to half-brother to half-brother. So King Abdullah is the fifth of those boys, and the old man had 44 sons by 22 wives, and 36 of them lived to adulthood, but they are all now rather elderly. The king is 90, and he has already outlived, in only 7 years, 2 of his brothers as crown prince. He's on his 3rd crown prince. So it's very reminiscent of the old Soviet Union in the 80s when Brezhnev, half-dead Brezhnev, died and was replaced by elderly Andropov, who died quickly and was replaced by elderly Chernyenko, who died quickly and was finally replaced by Gorbachev, but by then it was too late to save the system. So as Ronald Reagan said at that time, when there were basically 3 Soviet leaders in a little over 3 years' time, they keep dying on me. And that's what I think the President Obama and future American presidents are going to be dealing with, certainly here in the next 4 years. They have no ability to agree yet on the son of one of these brothers, because the 36 branches each fear that if my son gets it, your son, your whole branch is disenfranchised, because we'll pass it down in our branch, because there's not, I mean, it was easy to pass it from brother to brother, but how do you decide if you're going to pass it from cousin to cousin? Which cousin, when there are hundreds of them? The king tried to get around that by having an allegiance council with one person from every branch of the family that would decide. But when his first crown prince died, that group apparently met, and one of the brothers said, I should be the next crown prince, and the king said, no, I'm picking another brother. And that was the end of one man, one vote within the royal family. They never had the vote. There was an expression and a decision. So young Saudis do worry, just normal, ordinary Saudis, about what will happen. Will these cousins, if you will, quarrel with each other when the time comes? Because there are 3 basic units in the kingdom: a defense ministry, a national guard, and a huge interior operation that watches people and guards the oil facilities. So a lot of Saudis fear that somehow each of these is run by a prince, 3 cousins, that they will perhaps fight with each other, which has happened in the past among the royal family. It's what brought down the second Saudi state in the late 1880s. So if you're just a normal Saudi, you talk about what is my plan B. And most people don't know what their plan B is. So there's a lot of nervousness, a lot of frustration. And because this is a country that has no experience whatsoever with self-governance or even individual responsibility or civil society, they don't, most of them, a few talk about democracy, but most of them simply want what they describe as justice, and what they say they mean by that is a government that is more transparent, more accountable, more rule of law, where there are clear rules and they are enforced equally, not enforced or not enforced, as is often the case, but enforced based on who you are. I think this brings me to the what could happen. Obviously, one scenario is a continuation of the status quo, which I tend to think is the most likely, certainly in the short run, because the family, I think, A, can't bring itself to agree on a younger leader yet, and B, even though many of them say there has to be change, they don't agree on what that change is. So the status quo is the easiest thing, and the risk of that obviously is further economic stagnation and stultification and more unemployment. Unemployment among young Saudi men 20 to 24 is roughly 40%. And 40% of people live on Saudis, not foreigners, Saudis, live on less than $1,000 a month. So they're not all rich. And indeed, that wealth disparity is a source of anger among a lot of Sallies. Another option is that the society, there is some younger prince who tries to open up a bit and revive the economy. The risk of that is it produces a backlash among the conservatives who don't want more change and openness and opportunity for women, which they see as the road to ruin, if you're like my friend Lulu. And if you got a religious backlash, you could obviously have the, quote, modernizers, and that does not mean westernizers, modernizers, react to that backlash. The third is getting a leader who decides that the way to control this is to revert to the excessive religiosity of the 80s and 90s. After the attack on the Mecca Mosque in 1979, the Saudi king basically turned the country over to the religious fundamentalists, and 20 years of that bred the terrorists that produced 9/11. So Saudis understand that, and say that it couldn't happen again, but it's hard to entirely rule out. The fourth option is obviously some kind of chaos that leads to collapse, sparked by something like, in Tunisia with the young man burning himself to death. Saudis are very passive, but they also, young people at least, increasingly question, why can't we have more? Why does the royal family take more than their share? It may be, as the royal family likes to say, and as many in the U.S. government believe, that the status quo will hold, that there have always been predictions about trouble with the royal family, and they always come through. I personally think it could be different this time simply because of the external pressure in the region against the status quo, and because of the internal information and youth frustration, and lastly because the royal family is in this very difficult transition period. But I will close with my metaphor for the society, which I used in the book, of a 747 flying with the cockpit full of geriatric princes, first class full of princes who would be king and take over the cockpit, and economy full of frustrated young people, some Islamic fundamentalists who want to turn the plane around and go back to the past, and some Islamic terrorists who want to shoot the pilot and hijack the plane. And it continues to fly on, losing its oil wealth altitude, and that there may be somebody on the plane who could land it, but they seem unlikely to get an opportunity. And with that, I'd like to take your questions.
There will be a speaker, a microphone on either aisle, so if you'll just raise your hand. Because of CNN, we want to be sure you have the microphone in your hand when you start speaking, and have it close. And we're going to start with a student question. If you want to give a speech, maybe see me afterwards. We'll have you do the Licata lecture next year. But if you have a question, this is a good time for it.
Ms. House, thank you so much for today. My name is Erin. I'm a first-year student in the grad school. You deliberately, intentionally went to Saudi Arabia to immerse yourself in the culture, something that not many of us will have an opportunity to do. My question for you is, what, if anything, is Saudi Arabia doing in the realm of public diplomacy to help Westerners better understand them?
That's a good question. What, if anything, is Saudi Arabia doing in the realm of public diplomacy? I think they are giving a few tourist visas, but not much. And I don't know, though it may exist, some kinds of student exchanges. I know the U.S. brings Saudi students here on these State Department tours, and I met a young man there who actually had been very conservative, who confessed to beating up his brother in the 80s for listening to music. And he came on he was a Sharia law graduate, and he came on a legal tour of the U.S. and it completely changed his mind. He said it was the first time I ever knew that a woman could have her head uncovered and not be a whore. I mean, they have so many misconceptions of us, just as we do of them. My first dinner with that imam's family was very, very tense. He had his mother, his wife, and his 6 sisters. And, you know, they basically asked me, do you ever see your mother? They had this idea that, you know, American women are walking around, if not half-dressed, in an office, you know, doing no telling what, and paying no attention to their parents or children, and, you know, we're a family-oriented society. You know, over time, I think they got past that, but I'm a big fan of exchanges in both directions, but I do not know how much what they're doing to encourage people. I don't think they are doing a lot to encourage the average person to visit Saudi Arabia. Yes, sir.
Now, from my impression, the brand of Islam practiced in Saudi Arabia is more conservative, actually, than that in a lot of in the rest of the Muslim world. However, in a lot of ways, they seem friendlier to the West, and maybe it has to do with the sale of oil and just the continued necessity of that to continue their revenue stream. Now, you spoke that Saudi Arabia basically started as a fusion between the Saud family wanting to conquer the peninsula, and then the religious element, the Wahhabism, also wanting the same thing, but for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my question is, does religion basically continue to be used by the modern Saudi royal family and other elites to continue to control the population in sort of a disingenuous way, or are they actually religious?
Well, that obviously depends on the individual Saudi, but there's no question that religion is used to control the society. The official position and what is preached repeatedly by the religious establishment, and it is the only organization in the country. There are 70,000 mosques, and there are no other organizations. And the view of these religious people is that you must not cause chaos. So you must, if you want to challenge something, you must do it privately. There's a whole Islamic debate about what's the proper way to confront your leader, but in Saudi Arabia, the fundamental view of the religious is you do not confront them publicly. So when Osama bin Laden said, my Islamic view, and they hasten to point out he's not a religious scholar, but when he challenged the royal family in the 90s, his view was it's okay to call them out on not being properly religious, but it's not the common view. So religion does put something of a straitjacket over people. The imam I mentioned, whose wife and family I spent a lot of time with, and with him, he was very critical, but when I asked him, is it okay to confront your rulers, even he said no, because the big fear is of chaos, of causing a lack of harmony in the community of believers. The Ummah, as they call it, the community of believers, and keeping harmony there is very important. So if there's not real harmony, at least there's pretend harmony. You don't publicly, which is the reason why people can do all kinds of things in their homes, from drinking alcohol to having dinner with women they're not married to, or other gatherings, is that if it's in private, it does not disrupt the harmony of the community. If you do things in public that, if you will, flout the norm, that's what's bad. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering.
Could you wait just a second?
Oh. I was just wondering about the banking. How it's Wells Fargo or B of A. How do they get their FDIC? And is it a regular bank that they all go to in Saudi Arabia, or do they have a lot of American banks?
They have a lot of banks. There's a Dutch bank, a British bank, a French bank, and a lot of Saudi banks. Obviously, for the Saudi banks, there is the need to purport to be Sharia correct, so not to earn interest. And they have various ways, and the banks have Sharia experts who tell them how to do this. And it's another thing the very religious find very inappropriate, that you're not supposed to mix, it goes on, you're not supposed to earn interest, it's going on. You're not supposed to have infidels in the country, but the religious establishment approved the presence of U.S. troops in 1990 when it was necessary. You're not supposed to have movie theaters, but on the King's New University campus, there's a mosque and a movie theater side by side. There's also one at Aramco, the oil company, but the religious are not permitted inside the Aramco compound, which is obviously acceptable because it's Aramco that funds not only the religious but the entire country. And this is the thing that really eats at deeply religious people who would like to have a genuine Islam back to the 7th century, where we don't do these things, where the Prophet Muhammad ate out of a communal plate. We should be doing this. It's the divide in the country, I think, does get bigger as King Abdullah has tried to do a few things, giving scholarships to nearly 140,000 Saudis to study abroad, including women, putting 30 women in this 150-person Majlis Ashura, which has no power other than the power of debate, but that is, again, for the really conservative, a totally inappropriate thing to have women, and even though they're separated and covered, and it's not proper, so in their minds. So as he does these things, their opposition grows, and as their opposition grows, you know, the modernists try. So it is a tug of war, and there is a the fifth caliph after the death of Muhammad, leader of the faithful, set up the caliphate in Damascus, and he lasted for 20 years when the first four had all but one, killed by somebody rather quickly. So he was asked, how did you last so long? And he said, and this is what's practiced by the royal family now, I hold a hair between me and my people. When they pull, I yield. When they yield, I pull. And that is exactly what happens in Saudi Arabia. When the pressure builds, the king passes out money or sends students abroad. If the pressure builds in the other direction, our people aren't pulling, these things can roll back as they did in the 80s. So for instance, and then I'll stop on this, but the king, they had elections for municipal governments in 2005, again as part of the wash away the 9/11 stain in the rest of the world. And women, of course, were not permitted to vote, but there was supposed to be another election in 2009, and they were told they might be able to. When 2009 came, there was no election for anybody. And then in 2011 came, after the Arab Spring, suddenly there was an election for men, not women. But there was a need to be seen to give something, and so what had been promised but not given was then given. So that's largely how things work. As Saudis say, some of them say 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Some say 2 steps backward and 1 step forward, but whichever view you take, it's a small margin for maneuver. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you very much. And my name is Hiroshi Kagawa, and I'm journalist of intercultural communications. And I had a chance to went to Saudi once, and I placed several interviews to the local shop owners, and also people over there. And they are talking about your frustration that you mentioned, like youth or frustration. They are talking about a lot of, people surrounding the king. There are a lot of problems with people surrounding the king. They never talk about king himself.
Right.
And
It's always someone else's fault.
and any kingdom or any kind of structure of that country, there are taboo to talk about king. But many cases, people indirectly complaining to the king instead of saying he is bad, but his surrounding is bad. So from your observation, how would you think king can be a cushion of such kind of complaint, or king himself can be complained for the future?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
Question is, king can be like a cushion to release the frustration, or king can be a target for the future.
So is he an absorber of frustration or a target for that frustration? I think you're right that whoever the king is, people, even complainers, the worst that anybody will say, at least to me, about King Abdullah is he's surrounded by bad people who don't tell him what's going on, and he's an old man and he doesn't know, and they never criticize him directly, or almost never. So the king obviously is somebody that is all-powerful if he chooses to be, because whenever this king makes up his mind to do something, he does it, like the university, or there was a woman who was forcibly divorced from her husband by her brothers, who insisted the father had never given permission. Once the father died, they wanted the sister to divorce. She refused, once she was divorced, she refused to go home with her brothers, and she obviously couldn't go home with her husband, so she insisted on staying in jail, which she did for 4 years. And the case got a lot of publicity, and eventually the king involved himself to get a new judicial decision, which allowed the couple to remarry. So he is very much above the fray. As for becoming a target, I think it's likely to stay that way, that the royal family may be a target, if you will, of complaint. But there will probably continue to be, the people continue to give the king personally a pass and expect him to get involved and absorb things. And the royal family clearly can read the press. There's been a very big case of a religious man who beat his 5-year-old to death. And I saw just before coming up here, somebody sent me a story, assuming it's true, a story that the royal family has intervened to keep that man in prison for now, and not let him get out after 4 months, because you know they can hear when people are upset about things, and because the king is basically all powerful when he chooses to use it, they can do what they wish, but again, tethered to the religious and the need to retain their approval from the religious establishment, because when the first brother succeeded Ibn Saud in 1953, and he and his second brother basically quarreled for 10 years because the new king bankrupted the country. And in the end, the family decided we ought to get rid of him and take King Faisal. And the religious establishment was, in essence, called in to bless that. So I think a lot of royals, you know, realize you need to always be able to be in the good graces of the religious establishment. You might need them one day against each other, not just to help you with the people. And we have to go, but I thank you all very much.
I'm sure if all of you would agree with me that you'd like to spend 2-3 more hours here, such a fascinating experience that Karen has had, and to be willing to share it with us today. We appreciate it. Rosemary, thank you again for making this possible.
My pleasure.
And I would like to express appreciation to Rosemary Licata one more time. For those of you who are visiting here, you may not be familiar with the campus. There is a reception, you're all invited, and you would exit this building and go straight out toward the ocean, and as you come close to the edge, you'll turn left, and in this building that is next to us here, there is a reception and an executive dining room there, and it's all set up and ready for you. In the other direction, as you exit this auditorium,